For 12 years, my family called me a failure. They rejected me from Thanksgiving dinner, saying I was nobody special. The next day, sharing awkward leftovers, the local news came on and the state governor had something very different to say about who I really was. My name is Marielle Gramstad, and that moment changed everything. But let me take you back to where it all began, before the cameras, before the recognition, before my family discovered that their nobody special was actually somebody the entire state was talking about. Growing up in the Gramstad household meant understanding your place in the hierarchy. My father, Robert Gramstad, was a man who believed respect was earned through his approval alone. For 28 years of my life, I chased that approval like a dog begging for scraps at the dinner table. "You're a disappointment, Marielle," he'd say, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Just a supply clerk playing soldier. When are you going to get a real job?" My mother, Linda, would flutter around the kitchen like a nervous bird, always whispering the same refrain, "Don't upset your father, honey. He knows best." She'd been saying that for so long, I think she'd forgotten how to have her own opinion about anything, especially when it came to defending her children. Then there was my brother Jalen, 3 years younger and infinitely smarter about family politics. He learned early that the easiest path through the Gramstad house was to follow Dad's lead nod along with his opinions and never, ever take sides against him. Jalen wasn't malicious. He was just a survivor, and I couldn't blame him for that. But it stung every time he'd sit silent while Dad tore me down, or worse, join in with a nervous laugh. The truth was, my family believed they knew exactly who I was, Marielle, the disappointing daughter who'd joined the army because she couldn't hack it in the real world. To them, I was just a supply clerk pushing papers and counting inventory in some safe little office on a military base. Boring, safe, unremarkable. They had no idea that for the past 12 years, I'd been living a completely different life. While they thought I was organizing supply closets, I was actually running classified special operations counterterrorism missions across 3 continents. While they imagined me sitting behind a desk, I was rappelling out of helicopters in the dead of night, tracking down terrorists who wanted to turn American cities into graveyards. But here's the thing about classified work. You can't talk about it. Not to anyone. Not even family. Especially not family when they've made it clear they're not interested in listening anyway. So I played their game. I let them believe I was nobody special. I sent money home from my boring supply job, money that was actually combat pay and hazard bonuses earned in places I could never name. Every month without fail, I'd wire transfer funds to help with their mortgage, their car payments, their endless financial emergencies. The responses were always the same: a thumbs-up emoji from Mom, radio silence from Dad, maybe a thanks sis text from Jalen if I was lucky. Never a question about where the money came from, never curiosity about what it cost me to earn it. They just cashed it and moved on like I was some kind of automated payment system rather than their daughter bleeding money from war zones to keep their comfortable life intact. Every year I'd hope. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every family gathering, I'd hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time Dad would look at me and see something worth being proud of. Maybe this time when I walked through that door in my dress uniform, someone would ask about the ribbons on my chest or the stories behind my scars. But it never happened. Year after year, I'd sit at that dining room table feeling like a ghost listening to them talk around me rather than to me. Dad would hold court about his job at the insurance company. Jalen would share updates about his accounting career. Mom would fuss over everyone except me. I was furniture in my own family home, present but invisible, tolerated but not welcomed. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. It was the active disdain. Dad had this way of talking about the military that made it clear he thought we were all just government welfare cases, too stupid or lazy to make it in the private sector. He'd watch the news and make comments about those soldiers like we were some foreign species he couldn't understand. "Look at them begging for handouts," he'd say during Veterans Day coverage. "If they wanted respect, they should have gotten real jobs." Mun. I'd sit there biting my tongue knowing that just 2 weeks earlier I'd been in a classified briefing about preventing a chemical weapons attack on American soil. Knowing that while he was watching TV safely in his recliner, I'd been dodging bullets so other families could have the luxury of dismissing military service from their comfortable living rooms. But this year was supposed to be different. This year, I was finally transitioning out of active duty. After 12 years of classified operations, I was ready to come home for good. I had plans, maybe go back to school, maybe start a consulting business, definitely try to build some kind of relationship with the family I'd been protecting from the shadows. I'd been planning this Thanksgiving for months. I'd arranged extended leave, booked my flight early, even bought gifts for everyone. I imagined walking into that house and finally feeling like I belonged somewhere, like I had people who were genuinely happy to see me alive. Instead, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Don't come home. We decided it's best for you stay away this year." No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that this was the first Thanksgiving in 5 years I'd actually been stateside for. Just a cold dismissal like I was a subscription service they were canceling. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting in my small apartment near the base, surrounded by packed boxes and plane tickets I'd never use. The Christmas lights I'd hung across my window suddenly seemed ridiculous, cheerful decorations for a holiday celebration that wasn't going to happen. That night, I did something I'd never done before. Instead of accepting their rejection with graceful silence, I decided to look into my own finances. Specifically, I wanted to understand exactly how much of my nobody special money had been keeping the Gramstad family afloat all these years. What I discovered made me physically ill. 5 years ago, when Dad's credit had tanked due to some bad business investments, he'd called me in a panic. The bank was threatening to foreclose on their house. The same house I'd grown up in, the same house that represented everything stable and permanent in my chaotic military life. "Mariel, honey, I need you to co-sign something," he'd said, using the gentle tone he reserved for when he needed something. "It's just a technicality. The bank wants someone with good credit to back the loan." I was 23 years old, exhausted from a deployment, and desperate for any sign that my family needed me. So I signed the papers without reading them carefully. I trusted him. I trusted that my father wouldn't put me in a bad position, wouldn't take advantage of my love for them. Looking at those documents now, 5 years later, I realized exactly how naive I'd been. I wasn't just a co-signer. Due to Dad's poor credit score, I'd actually become the primary borrower. My name was first on the mortgage. My credit was backing the entire loan. And due to some legal language I'd been too young and trusting to understand, I technically owned 51% of the house. The house they'd just banned me from was actually my house, but it got worse. Much worse. As I dug deeper into the property records, I discovered something that made my hands shake with rage. For the past 2 years, while telling me they were struggling financially, while accepting my monthly payments to help with the mortgage, my family had been running an illegal rental business out of my house. They'd converted the basement and the attic into makeshift apartments, renting them out to college students for cash. No permits, no tax reporting, no legal documentation. Just pure profit flowing directly into their pockets while they cried poor and cashed my checks. The irony was so thick I could taste it. They'd used my name and credit to buy a house, then turned it into a profit center while telling me I didn't belong there. They'd taken my money with one hand while pushing me away with the other. But as I sat there that Friday night, surrounded by evidence of their financial betrayal and nursing the fresh wound of their Thanksgiving rejection, I had no idea that the state governor was about to change my life forever. The phone call came Friday morning, while I was still processing the emotional whiplash of discovering my family's financial deception. It was my mother, and her voice had that artificially bright quality it took on when she was trying to smooth over one of Dad's cruelties. "Mariel, honey, I was wondering, would you maybe want to come over for dinner tonight? We have so many leftovers from yesterday and it seems silly to let them go to waste." I almost laughed. 24 hours earlier, I wasn't welcome at their Thanksgiving table. Now suddenly, I was good enough for the leftovers. "Why the change of heart, Mom?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear her wringing her hands. "Well, Mrs. Henderson from next door asked where you were yesterday, and well, it felt awkward to explain. Maybe we were a bit hasty. Ah, there it was. Not guilt about hurting their daughter. Not remorse about rejecting a family member during the holidays. Just embarrassment about what the neighbors might think. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to hang up, block their numbers, and start building a life that didn't revolve around begging for scraps of affection from people who clearly didn't value me. But I still went. God help me, I still went. Because despite everything, the years of dismissal, the financial betrayal, the Thanksgiving rejection, some pathetic part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, they might see me differently. That maybe this time, sitting around that same dining room table, someone would ask me about my life, my service, my dreams for the future. I arrived at 6 p.m., and the awkwardness was immediately suffocating. Mom answered the door with an overly enthusiastic hug that felt like she was performing for an invisible audience. Dad grunted a greeting from his recliner, not bothering to look up from his football game. Jalen gave me a half-hearted wave and a mumbled, "Hey sis," before returning to his phone. The dining room table was set with the same plates from yesterday, but now there were only 4 place settings instead of the 6 they'd had for their real Thanksgiving dinner with extended family members I apparently wasn't worthy to meet. The turkey was dry from reheating, the stuffing had congealed into a brick, and the cranberry sauce had developed a skin on top. But we all pretended it was normal. We all sat there making stilted conversation about the weather and Jalen's job and Dad's golf game, carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that I'd been explicitly uninvited from this same meal 24 hours earlier. "So, Marielle," Mom said, clearly working from some mental script she'd prepared, "how are things at your job?" She couldn't even say the Army with confidence. After 12 years of my military service, she still acted like she didn't understand what I did for a living. "Fine," I said, cutting into the cardboard turkey. "Same as always." "Still doing that supply thing?" Dad asked, not looking up from his plate. "Something like that." The silence stretched out like a rubber band ready to snap. I watched my family eat their reheated Thanksgiving dinner, and I wondered what exactly I was doing there. What was I hoping to accomplish? Did I really think one awkward meal was going to repair 12 years of emotional neglect? That's when the local news came on in the background. Mom always insisted on having the TV on during dinner, claiming it helped with conversation, but really it just gave everyone an excuse to avoid talking to each other. The news had become white noise in the Gramstad household, a steady stream of other people's problems that we could collectively ignore while avoiding our own. But tonight was different. Tonight, as we sat there picking at our sad leftovers, the anchor's voice cut through our uncomfortable silence with words that made my blood freeze. "Coming up after the break, Governor Martinez honors hometown heroes in a special ceremony at the state capitol." I nearly choked on my stuffing. The ceremony. How had I forgotten about the ceremony 3 weeks ago? I'd gotten a call from the state governor's office. A call I'd assumed was some kind of bureaucratic mistake. Governor Martinez wanted to personally honor several military service members who were transitioning out of active duty. Specifically, she wanted to recognize recipients of the Intelligence Star, which was apparently a bigger deal than I'd realized. The Intelligence Star is the nation's 3rd highest military honor given to service members who distinguish themselves in classified operations involving national security. I'd received mine 6 months earlier for a series of operations that I still couldn't talk about in detail, operations that had prevented several planned terrorist attacks on American soil. When the governor's aide had called to invite me to the ceremony, I'd been honored but not particularly excited. Military ceremonies were a dime a dozen in my world. I'd sat through hundreds of them over the years, medal presentations, change of command ceremonies, retirement dinners. They all blended together after a while, but this one was different. This one was being covered by local media. This one was happening in my home state with my hometown listed in the press materials, and I hadn't told my family about it. At the time, I'd told myself it was because they wouldn't be interested. They'd never cared about my military achievements before. Why would this be different? But sitting there now, watching Jalen scroll through his phone while Dad complained about the referees in his football game, I realized the real reason I'd kept quiet. I wanted to see if they'd care enough to find out on their own. Wonder what loser they're calling a hero this time, Jalen muttered, not looking up from his screen. Dad snorted in agreement. Probably another participation trophy. Everyone's a hero these days. The commercial break seemed to last forever. I sat there, heart-pounding, knowing that in about 90 seconds, my entire family was about to discover exactly what their nobody special daughter had been doing for the past 12 years. Part of me wanted to warn them. Part of me wanted to grab the remote and change the channel or make some excuse about needing to leave early. But a larger part of me, the part that was tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed, tired of watching my own family treat me like an embarrassing stranger, wanted to see their faces when they learned the truth. The news was about to return, and my family was about to discover why the government had been trying to reach me for weeks. I took a sip of my water and waited for my world to explode. The commercial ended, and anchor Jennifer Walsh appeared on screen with her professional smile and perfectly styled hair. Behind her, the state capitol building glowed in the evening light, its dome illuminated against the darkening sky. Good evening, I'm Jennifer Walsh. Tonight, Governor Martinez honored several exceptional military service members in a ceremony recognizing their extraordinary contributions to our national security. My mother reached for the remote, probably planning to change the channel. The Gramstads had never been particularly interested in military news. But something made her hesitate, her hand freezing halfway to the coffee table. The screen shifted to footage from earlier that day. Governor Martinez stood at a podium in the Capitol Rotunda, flanked by American flags, and surrounded by military officials in dress uniforms. Her voice was clear and authoritative as she began to speak. Today, I have the profound honor of recognizing some of our state's most distinguished veterans. The governor said, her words carrying the weight of genuine respect. These men and women have served our nation in classified operations, protecting American families from threats they will never know existed. The camera panned across a small group of veterans in dress blues, their chests decorated with ribbons and medals that told stories most of them would never be allowed to share. I wasn't visible in the shot. This was B-roll footage from the general ceremony, but I knew I was somewhere in that group. Dad shifted in his chair, probably getting ready to launch into one of his familiar rants about military spending or government waste. But before he could speak, Governor Martinez continued, and her next words changed everything. Today, I want to specifically recognize one remarkable individual whose hometown is right here in our state. This woman has spent the last 12 years in classified counterterrorism operations, and her work has directly prevented multiple planned attacks on American soil. The camera zoomed in on the governor's face as she lifted a sheet of official-looking paper from the podium. It is my distinct privilege to honor Marielle Gramstad of Cedar Falls, recipient of the Intelligence Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Bronze Star with Valor Device. The fork slipped from Jalen's hand and clattered against his plate. Mom's mouth fell open in a perfect O of shock. Dad's head snapped up from his dinner so fast I thought he might give himself whiplash, but the governor wasn't finished. Ms. Gramstad's classified operations are credited with preventing no fewer than 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil, including planned chemical weapons attacks on civilian targets in Chicago and New York. Her actions have quite literally saved thousands of American lives. The news footage cut to a professional photo of me in my dress uniform, ribbons gleaming across my chest, looking directly into the camera with the confident bearing of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions in hostile territory. It was a photo I had taken for official military publications, never imagining my family would see it on their local news. The silence in the dining room was deafening. Jennifer Walsh's voice continued from the television. Governor Martinez emphasized that many of Gramstad's operations remain classified, but she was able to share that this decorated veteran spent consecutive Thanksgivings in combat zones, protecting American families while being unable to return to her own. That last line hit like a physical blow. I watched my family's faces as the implications sank in while they were safely carving turkey and complaining about their comfortable middle-class problems. I was literally dodging bullets so they could continue living in blissful ignorance of the dangers that surrounded them. The governor's voice returned to the broadcast. Heroes like Mariel Gramstad represent the very best of American service. They operate in shadows so that others can live in the light. They sacrifice their own safety, their own family time, their own peace of mind, so that the rest of us can sleep soundly at night. The news package concluded with more footage of the ceremony showing me stepping forward to shake the governor's hand as she presented a state-level commendation. I was smiling in the footage, genuinely honored to be recognized, but there was something sad in my eyes that I hadn't noticed at the time. The sadness of someone who knew her own family would never see this moment. Jennifer Walsh returned to the screen for her closing remarks. Gramstad is currently transitioning out of active duty and plans to remain in the state. Governor Martinez announced that she has personally invited Gramstad to consider opportunities in state-level security consulting. The broadcast moved on to the next story, something about a local school fundraiser. But nobody in the dining room was paying attention anymore. We sat frozen in tableau, 4 people around a table laden with leftover turkey staring at a television that had just revealed one of us was a decorated war hero. Jalen was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Holy shit, that's our Mariel." Dad's face had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But she's just supply... I set down my fork and looked around the table at my family who had spent 12 years dismissing my service, who had rejected me from Thanksgiving dinner just 24 hours earlier, who had been illegally profiting from property they owned thanks to my good credit while telling me I wasn't welcome in their home. Surprise. I said, my voice calm and steady, despite the hurricane of emotions swirling in my chest. Your nobody special is somebody after all. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of the television and my mother's quiet, shocked breathing. I could see them all trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the daughter they'd dismissed with the war hero they'd just watched being honored by the governor. Finally, Dad found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "Mariel, we had no idea." "You had no idea," I repeated, and I could feel 12 years of suppressed anger beginning to bubble to the surface because you never asked. I stood up from the table and walked to my purse, pulling out a manila folder I'd brought with me, not planning to use it, but carrying it like a security blanket. Inside were redacted copies of some of my mission reports documents I was legally allowed to share now that I was transitioning out of active duty. I dropped the folder on the table between the leftover mashed potatoes and the congealed cranberry sauce. "Christmas 2018, I said, opening to the first document. "While you were opening presents and complaining about Mom's dry turkey, I was in Chicago preventing a suicide bombing at O'Hare Airport. 12 potential casualties turned into 0 casualties because my team intercepted the bomber before he could reach the terminal." I flipped to the next page, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Thanksgiving 2020. Remember how I called to say I couldn't make it home? I was in New York City tracking down a terrorist cell that had acquired chemical weapons and was planning to release them in the subway system during the holiday travel rush. We stopped them 6 hours before the planned attack. Estimated casualties if we'd failed 3,000 people. Dad was staring at the documents, like they were written in a foreign language, which in a way they were. The language of classified operations, of life and death decisions, of consequences so severe that failure wasn't an option. "Every Thanksgiving you celebrated safely." I continued, my voice beginning to shake with emotion. "Every Christmas you spent complaining about your comfortable problems, every family gathering where you made it clear I was an inconvenience. I was in danger zones protecting American families, including this one." Mom finally found her voice, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question hung in the air, and I felt something break inside my chest. All the years of hoping they'd ask about my work, all the times I'd bitten my tongue when they dismissed military service, all the monthly payments I'd sent home, while bleeding from injuries they never knew I'd sustained. Tell you what, I asked, my voice rising. Tell you that your failure was saving American lives. Tell you that while you were calling me a disappointment, I was preventing terrorist attacks. Tell you that your nobody special was somebody the governor wanted to honor. I gestured at the television, which was now showing a commercial for car insurance, completely oblivious to the family drama unfolding in living rooms across the state. Would you have listened? Would you have cared? Or would you have found some way to minimize it, to make it less important than Dad's golf game or Jalen's accounting job? The truth was settling over them like a heavy blanket. I could see the realization dawning in their eyes, not just about my military service, but about how they'd treated me for years, how they'd dismissed my sacrifices, taken my money, and pushed me away while I was literally risking my life for their safety. But the TV news wasn't the biggest shock I had for them. I was about to reveal something that would change who controlled this house forever. The weight of the revelation was still settling over the dining room when I reached into my purse and pulled out a second folder, this one containing documents that would shift the power dynamic in this house permanently. "There's something else you need to know," I said, setting the new folder on the table next to the mission reports. "About this house. About who actually owns it." Dad's eyes narrowed, his shock beginning to transform into the defensive anger I knew so well. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and spread out the documents: the original mortgage agreement, the title transfer papers, the property tax records, and most importantly, the co-signer agreement that had made all of this possible. 5 years ago, when your credit was so bad that the bank wouldn't loan you money to refinance this house, you called me, I said, pointing to his signature on the bottom of the mortgage documents. "Remember, you said it was just a technicality, that you needed someone with good credit to back the loan." Dad's face was reddening, but I could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He remembered, but he'd never bothered to read the fine print of what he'd asked me to sign. What I didn't understand at the time, because I was 23 years old and trusted you not to screw me over, was that your credit was so bad the bank required me to be the primary borrower. I tapped the document with my finger. "My name is first on this mortgage. My credit score is what got you this loan. And according to the legal language you had me sign, I own 51% of this house." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the stunned quiet of people processing unexpected good news about a family member. This was the heavy silence of people realizing they'd made a catastrophic mistake. "That's impossible," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out the property deed and slid it across the table. "Read it yourself. Marielle Gramstad, primary owner. Robert Gramstad, secondary owner. It's all right there in black and white." Jalen leaned over to look at the documents, his accounting background helping him parse the legal language faster than our parents. His face went pale as he traced the signatures and ownership percentages with his finger. "Holy shit, Dad," he whispered. "She's right. Her name is first on everything." But I wasn't finished. The property ownership was just the beginning of what I'd discovered during my investigation into their finances. "It gets better," I said, pulling out the final set of documents from the folder. "These are bank records showing rental income deposits to your account over the past 2 years. Deposits that correspond exactly to the illegal rental agreements you've been running out of this house." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad's face went from red to white in about 3 seconds. "That's right," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. "While you've been accepting my monthly payments to help with the mortgage, payments that total $127,000 over the past 8 years, by the way, you've also been running an illegal rental business out of the house that I legally own." I spread out the bank statements pointing to the regular deposits. $2,400 a month in unreported rental income, no permits, no tax reporting, no legal documentation, just pure profit flowing into your pockets while you told me you were struggling financially. The implications were sinking in, and I could see the panic building in Dad's eyes. Not only had they discovered that their failure daughter was a decorated war hero, but they were also realizing that she legally owned the house they'd just banned her from, and she had documentation of their illegal rental scheme. "The irony is just incredible," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You used my name and my credit to buy this house, then told me I didn't belong here. You took my money with one hand while pushing me away with the other. You built a nice little cash business using my property while calling me a disappointment." Dad tried to rally, falling back on the bluster and intimidation that had worked on his family for decades. "Now you listen here, young lady." "No." The word came out sharp and final, cutting through his attempt to regain control. "You listen. For 12 years, I've listened to you tell me I'm a failure. I'm nobody special. I'm an embarrassment to this family. But the reality is that I'm the most accomplished person at this table. I own the majority of this house, and I have legal documentation of your financial crimes." I stood up, feeling taller and stronger than I had in years. The power dynamic that had defined our family for decades was crumbling in real time. You want to know what's really embarrassing? The fact that your neighbors, your coworkers, your entire community just watched the governor honor your daughter on television, and you can't explain why she wasn't at your Thanksgiving table. As if summoned by my words, the phone started ringing. Mom looked at the caller ID, and her face went even paler. "It's Mrs. Henderson," she whispered. The phone kept ringing. Then Dad's cell phone buzzed, then Jalen's. Word was spreading fast in their small community. The Gramstad daughter was a war hero, and people wanted to know why the family hadn't mentioned it before. Dad stared at his buzzing phone like it was a venomous snake. "We can't answer that. What are we supposed to tell them?" "You could try the truth," I suggested. "Tell them you banned your decorated veteran daughter from Thanksgiving dinner because you thought she was a failure." The landline stopped ringing, only to start up again immediately. Someone really wanted to talk to the Gramstads about their war hero daughter. "Marielle, please," Mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We made a mistake. We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out," I interrupted. "For 12 years I sent you money from combat zones. For 12 years I called on holidays and birthdays. For 12 years I hoped that someday you might ask about my work, my life, my dreams for the future. Instead, you took my money, dismissed my service, and treated me like an inconvenience." I gathered up the documents and put them back in the folder, my movements calm and deliberate. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady and professional, the voice I used when briefing government officials on national security threats. "You have 3 choices. Option 1, you can move out of my house and find somewhere else to live. Option 2, you can stay and pay me fair market rent, which is $2,800 a month for a house this size in this neighborhood. Option 3, you can buy out my ownership stake, which would be about $240,000 based on current property values." The silence was deafening. I could practically hear them doing the math, realizing they couldn't afford any of those options without significant lifestyle changes. "Those are your choices," I continued. "What you can't do anymore is live rent-free in my house while running illegal rental schemes and treating me like garbage." Dad's face was cycling through emotions: anger, panic, desperation, and something that might have been the beginning of actual remorse. "We can't afford that much rent," he admitted quietly. "Then you'll need to learn to live within your means," I replied. "Maybe get rid of the boat you bought with my money. Maybe cancel the golf club membership. Maybe stop taking vacations to Florida while your veteran daughter eats MREs in combat zones." The phone rang again. This time it was Jalen's girlfriend, probably calling after seeing the news coverage on social media. "We need to answer these calls," Mom said desperately. "People are asking questions." "Then you better figure out what you're going to tell them," I said, standing up and putting on my jacket. "Because the truth is out there now, and everyone in town knows that you have a war hero daughter who wasn't welcome at your Thanksgiving table." I headed toward the door, but turned back for one final statement. "I'm staying at the Holiday Inn downtown tonight. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a property management company to discuss taking over full management of this house. You have until Monday to decide which option you want to choose. After that, I'll make the decision for you." What I said next would determine if this family had any future together at all. And if you choose to stay and pay rent, there's going to be one non-negotiable condition: family therapy, because this dysfunction ends now, one way or another. The next 24 hours changed everything. By Saturday morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Local news stations were running follow-up pieces about the hometown hero whose family had somehow failed to mention her military achievements to their community. Social media was buzzing with posts from neighbors and local business owners who were suddenly connecting dots, realizing that the quiet young woman they'd occasionally seen around town was actually the decorated veteran being honored by the governor. I watched it all unfold from my hotel room, fielding calls from reporters who wanted to interview me about my military service, and more uncomfortably about my family situation. Word had somehow gotten out that I hadn't been present at family Thanksgiving gatherings, and people were drawing their own conclusions. The calls to my parents' house hadn't stopped. Mrs. Henderson, their next-door neighbor, had apparently been telling everyone at her Saturday morning book club about watching Marielle Gramstad get honored on TV, and how she'd always wondered why such a nice girl never seemed to be around for family holidays. Around noon, Jalen showed up at my hotel. "Can I come up?" he asked when I met him in the lobby. "We need to talk." He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. His usual carefully maintained appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. The stress of having his family's dysfunction suddenly exposed to public scrutiny was taking its toll. "Mom's been crying since you left," he said once we were sitting in my hotel room. "Dad's been pacing around the house like a caged animal. The phone won't stop ringing, and we don't know what to tell people." I felt a pang of something, not quite guilt, but an acknowledgement of the pain my revelations were causing. These were still my family members, still people I'd once loved unconditionally, even if they'd never returned that love in the way I needed. "What do you want me to tell you, Jalen?" "That I'm sorry for telling the truth, that I should have kept letting Dad treat me like garbage to protect his reputation." "No," he said quietly. "Actually, I came to apologize, and to tell you that you're right about the therapy thing. We're all messed up and it's not fair what we've done to you." This was not what I'd expected. Jalen had spent years following Dad's lead, never standing up to him, never taking my side in family conflicts. Hearing him acknowledge the family's dysfunction was both validating and heartbreaking. "I was scared of him," Jalen continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that's not an excuse, but Dad has this way of making you feel like you're either with him or against him. There's no middle ground, and I chose the easy path. I stayed on his good side by not defending you." He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, genuine remorse mixed with a kind of desperate honesty. "But watching that news coverage last night, seeing what you've actually been doing all these years while we treated you like you were nothing? Jesus, Marielle. I feel sick about it. We all should." "Where's this coming from?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "The calls haven't just been from neighbors," he admitted. 3 different reporters have called asking for family comments about your military service. One of them asked point blank why you weren't at our Thanksgiving dinner. Mom tried to deflect, but the reporter had done her homework. She knew you'd been stateside since October. She knew you were transitioning out of active duty. She knew you should have been available for family holidays. The media attention was clearly making the family's rejection of me a public relations nightmare. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. "So you're here because you're embarrassed," I said. "I'm here because I'm ashamed," he corrected. "There's a difference." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown local number. I almost declined it, but something made me answer. "Ms. Gramstad, this is Mayor Patricia Hoffman. I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I got your number from the governor's office. I was wondering if you might have time to meet with me this afternoon. The city council has something we'd like to discuss with you." I agreed to meet at City Hall at 3 p.m., curious about what they could possibly want. After I hung up, Jalen was staring at me with something approaching awe. "The mayor wants to meet with you, apparently." "Do you know what this means?" he asked. "The whole town is talking about you. People are proud that someone from here did something so important, and we—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "And you treated me like garbage." I finished for him. He nodded miserably. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Mayor Hoffman's office trying to process what she was proposing. "The city council met in emergency session this morning," she explained, gesturing to a folder full of documents on her desk. "We want to offer you a position as our Director of Emergency Preparedness and Public Safety. It would involve consulting on security protocols, emergency response planning, and coordinating with federal agencies on threat assessment." I stared at her, speechless. 24 hours ago, my own family had considered me a failure. Now, the mayor of my hometown was offering me a job. The position comes with a substantial salary, $85,000 to start, with full benefits and a city vehicle. We've also been in contact with several federal contractors who are interested in partnering with us on security initiatives, which could mean additional consulting income for you. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Marielle, we've had decorated veterans before, but never someone with your specific expertise in counterterrorism and intelligence operations. With the way the world is changing, with the threats we're facing as a nation, having someone of your caliber working for our community, it would be invaluable." The irony was overwhelming. The same community that had watched my family dismiss me for years was now offering me a position of respect and authority. "There's one more thing," Mayor Hoffman said, pulling out a final document. "The City Council also voted unanimously to declare next Saturday Marielle Gramstad Day in honor of your service. We're planning a ceremony in the town square with full military honors. Governor Martinez has agreed to attend." I drove back to the hotel in a daze, my phone buzzing with congratulatory calls and text messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. High school classmates who had seen the news coverage, former teachers who remembered me, local business owners who wanted to thank me for my service. But the call that mattered most came at 6 p.m. "Marielle?" It was Dad's voice, and he sounded like he'd aged 10 years in 24 hours. Could you come home? We need to talk. All of us together." I found them waiting in the living room. Mom, Dad, and Jalen, all sitting stiffly on the couch like children called to the principal's office. The TV was off, which was unusual for the Gramstad house. Usually the television provided a buffer against uncomfortable conversations. Dad cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Smaller, humbler, stripped of the bluster and authority that had defined him for as long as I'd known him. "We've been talking since you left," he said. "About what you said about the therapy, about how we've treated you all these years." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily to him. "I called Dr. Reeves. You remember her? She counseled the Andersons when they were having marriage problems. She has an opening next Thursday. For family therapy, all 4 of us." This was not what I'd expected. I'd thought they might agree to pay rent or maybe even ask me to leave so they could avoid the public embarrassment. I hadn't expected them to actually take the therapy suggestions seriously. "We also talked to a financial planner," Mom added quietly, "about the house, about our options. We can't afford to buy out your share, and we can't afford market rent on Dad's salary." "So, what are you proposing?" I asked. Dad took a deep breath. "We're proposing that we try to earn our way back into being your family. Real family, not the broken version we've been for the past 12 years. He pulled out a handwritten letter and set it on the coffee table. "I wrote this for the newspaper. It's a public apology, to you and to the community, acknowledging that we failed to support and honor your military service, acknowledging that we made terrible mistakes in how we treated you." I picked up the letter and read it. It was surprisingly thorough and genuinely remorseful, acknowledging specific failures and taking full responsibility for the family's dysfunction. "If you'll let us stay in the house," Dad continued, "we'll pay what we can afford in rent, $1,200 a month, which is what we can manage without the boat and the golf membership and some other expenses we're cutting, and we'll go to therapy, all of us, for as long as it takes to fix this family." "And if therapy doesn't work?" I asked. Then we'll accept whatever decision you make about the house, Mom said. But we're hoping it won't come to that. I looked around the room at these three people who had shaped my childhood, who had driven me to excel and achieve and prove myself in ways that had ultimately saved thousands of lives. Their rejection had made me stronger, but their acceptance might have made me happier. "There's one more condition," I said finally. They waited, tension radiating from their rigid postures. "I'm taking the job with the city. I'm staying in town, at least for now, which means you're going to have to get used to seeing me around, to having people ask you about your war hero daughter. You're going to have to learn to be proud of me in public, not just apologetic in private." Dad nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "We can do that. We want to do that. And next Saturday at the ceremony, the mayor is planning you're all going to be there, front row, clapping when they call my name." "We'll be there," Jalen said immediately. "We'll be proud to be there," Mom added. I looked at my father, the man whose approval I'd chased for 28 years, the man whose rejection had driven me to achieve things he couldn't even comprehend. "Dad?" He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to find words. "I'll be the proudest father in that crowd," he said finally, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for how long it took me to see who you really are." 1 year later, everything had changed. The following Thanksgiving was unlike any the Gramstad family had ever experienced. I arrived at the house. My house, though, the dynamic had shifted from ownership as leverage to ownership as responsibility. At 4 p.m., carrying a bottle of wine and a sense of cautious optimism that had taken months of family therapy to develop. The transformation was immediately visible. The dining room table was set for 12 people instead of the usual 4, and the additional guests weren't random college students paying rent under the table. They were women I'd met through my work with the city's new Veterans Transition Program, female veterans who were struggling with their own family relationships, their own battles with civilian reintegration, their own searches for belonging and purpose. Marielle, Sarah Martinez, a former Marine intelligence analyst, jumped up to hug me as I entered. "Your mom's been teaching us her stuffing recipe. Apparently there are very specific opinions about bread cubes versus torn bread." I looked over at Mom, who was bustling around the kitchen with more energy and joy than I'd seen from her in years. The past 12 months had been transformative for her, too. Therapy had helped her find her voice, and my success in the community had given her something to genuinely brag about to her book club friends. "Where's Dad?" I asked. "Back patio," Jalen said, emerging from the kitchen with a serving bowl. "He's grilling turkey with Mike. Apparently, they've got some kind of military grilling technique they're experimenting with." Mike was Captain Michael Torres, recently retired from Army Special Operations, who'd become both a colleague and a close friend over the past year. He was also, though we hadn't made it official yet, something more than a friend. Having someone in my life who understood the weight of classified service, who didn't need explanations for the scars or the nightmares, or the way I sometimes went quiet during fireworks, displays had been a revelation. I walked out to the back patio and found Dad and Mike deep in conversation about brine temperatures and smoking techniques. Dad looked up when he saw me, and his face broke into the kind of genuine smile I'd spent 28 years hoping to see. "There she is," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt natural and unforced. "Mike was just telling me about the counter-surveillance training you two conducted for the police department last week. Sounds like you've got half the county wanting to hire you for security consulting." The change in Dad had been the most dramatic of all. Therapy had helped him understand that his need to control and diminish others came from his own feelings of inadequacy, his own fear that he hadn't accomplished anything significant with his life. Discovering that his daughter was genuinely exceptional had initially threatened his ego, but eventually it had become a source of legitimate pride. "Speaking of which," I said, "I got another call from the state police yesterday. They want to send a team down for that threat assessment workshop we developed." "That's my girl," Dad said, and the words carried none of the condescension they might have held a year ago. They were simply true. I was his girl, his daughter, someone he was genuinely proud to claim. The dinner itself was chaotic and wonderful in ways our family meals had never been before. 12 women around the table sharing stories and laughter, talking shop about military service and civilian transitions, debating everything from foreign policy to the proper way to fold-fitted sheets. But the moment that meant the most came when Dad stood up to give the traditional Thanksgiving toast, a ritual he'd always used to hold court and emphasize his role as family patriarch. "I want to start," he said, raising his glass of wine, "by acknowledging something that should have been acknowledged years ago. Every person at this table tonight is here because of Marielle's service. Her service to our country, her service to our community, and her incredible generosity in opening our home to create a new kind of family." He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "For too many years, I thought being a father meant being the most important person in the room. I thought respect was something you demanded rather than something you earned. I thought strength meant making others feel small." The table had gone quiet, everyone sensing the weight of what he was trying to say. "My daughter taught me that real strength means protecting others even when they don't know they need protection. Real leadership means serving something bigger than yourself even when no one will ever know what you sacrificed. And real family means showing up for each other, especially when it's hard." He raised his glass higher. "So I'm thankful, deeply thankful, that my daughter is stronger than I raised her, to be braver than I ever taught her to be, and more generous than I deserved her to be. I'm thankful that she didn't give up on this family, even when this family gave up on her." The toast echoed around the table, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heart finally healing from wounds I'd carried for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to not have them. Later, after the dishes were done and most of the guests had gone home, I found myself sitting on the front porch with Mom watching the November sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. It was a simple question, but it made me think about everything that had changed in the past year. The job with the city had evolved into a consulting business that kept me busier than I'd ever been in the military. The Veterans Transition program we'd started was being used as a model by 3 other states. I had a relationship with a man who understood and valued my service, a family that was finally functional, and a community that genuinely respected what I'd accomplished. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with how easily the answer came. "I really am." "Good," Mom said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You deserve to be happy. You've always deserved to be happy." The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, now converted into a guest room for visiting veterans, and realized that for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly at home. Not because the house belonged to me legally, though that remained true. Not because my family had finally learned to treat me with respect, though that was transformative. But because I had built something bigger than just personal success or professional achievement. I had built a new kind of family, one that included the people I'd been born to and the people I'd chosen, all united by shared values of service, sacrifice, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The girl who had left this house at 18, desperate to prove herself worthy of love, had finally learned the most important lesson of all: she had always been worthy. The love she'd been chasing had been inside her all along, waiting for the right people to recognize it and reflect it back to her. At the kitchen table over coffee and leftover pie, Dad was showing Mike and Sarah the scrapbook he'd started keeping of newspaper articles about my work with the city. Mom was planning the menu for Christmas dinner, assuming naturally that I'd be there, that this was where I belonged. And Jalen, who had grown into a man I was genuinely proud to call my brother, looked up from his laptop and grinned at me. "Hey sis, you need to see this. The governor's office just announced the recipients of this year's State Service Awards. Guess whose name is at the top of the list?" I learned that home isn't where you're tolerated, it's where you're celebrated. Home isn't where your achievements are diminished, it's where they're honored. And home isn't where you have to prove your worth. It's where your worth is already understood and valued. For 12 years, I had protected American families while feeling like I didn't have a family of my own. Now I knew the truth. I hadn't lost my family. I had just been building a better one piece by piece until it was strong enough to hold all the love I'd been carrying around with nowhere to put it. My name is Marielle Gramstad, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's transforming them into family.